This video is brought to you by my kind Patreon supporters and channel members. If you enjoy my content and seek to take your support a step further, you can freely join my Patreon or become a channel member with several added benefits. With that out of the way, enjoy today's content. Monarchism is perhaps one of the most misunderstood political systems in the world. Most people have moved away from the idea of monarchism because they deem it to be an old system from the Middle Ages that is in no way superior to modern republics. Majority of us are probably already familiar with the stereotypical presentation of a king or emperor, a man sitting on a golden throne in his castle, hoarding all the money for himself, living a life full of luxury, all the while his subjects lack basic needs like food and healthcare. This sort of stereotype has been portrayed in many cartoons, movies, and comic books. And thanks to these stereotypes, many people have the impression that a king is something backwards from days gone by, and insist that people who still believe in the ideology of monarchism are anti-progressive, stuck in the medieval period. And as I said, monarchism today is not exactly popular, except if you speak of countries which already are monarchies in the modern day. But I am specifically referring to strict republican nations in which just the idea of a monarchy is something to laugh at, and that's why in these nations you won't really find much support for monarchism. And as a monarchist who lives in a strictly republican nation, I can confirm this. The few people in real life I have revealed my monarchist views to always ask the same questions. Why do we need a king in this day and age? Don't you believe that people need to have a say in who runs their nation? Won't a king trample our freedoms? Isn't monarchy just a dictator, a tyrant, and so on? And seeing how monarchism is not exactly popular in the world, you don't see monarchists that commonly on your average social media page, especially YouTube. But here I am today to finally join in as a defender of monarchist and traditional values, alongside many other of my friends who helped me write the script for this video. Without further ado, let's address our very first myth about monarchism. We will start off with perhaps the most famous claim about monarchism, and that monarchism is just too expensive. Why should we pay money to one man who can then choose to spend it on whatever he wants? Now, not only is the claim that all tax money goes to the monarch completely false, but also that it doesn't really work that way, and it's not as black and white as it may seem. Let's take the United Kingdom as an example. Currently, the government pays around £100 million each year to maintain the royal family, which means that an average British citizen pays the royal family around £4.5 each year through taxes, which is certainly not a lot. But one thing almost never mentioned is the fact that the royal family personally holds a good chunk of land known as the royal estate, and it is through these estates that the royal family earns about £312 million each year, or to be exact, it's what they should be earning. Every single British monarch since the times of George III has voluntarily turned over all the profits from the estate towards the government, and in return, the government would give them an annual salary. Meaning that the United Kingdom earns around £200 million every year thanks to the royal family. The royals are perfectly able to sustain themselves without taxpayer money, and would be earning 3 times more than what they already earn. And if the royals decided to take back all their deserved revenue from the estates, the government would actually be losing money, which in return means that taxes would be increased on ordinary citizens and not decreased as many would believe. But I hear you saying, why don't we just confiscate all that land and take all the profits for ourselves? Well, in this case, if the crown estates were privatized, the government would only be earning a specified amount from the corporate tax, and all other revenue would go to the company itself. so the United Kingdom would still be losing more money and only getting a small amount of the revenue. Point being, it is thanks to the royal family that the average British citizen is paying less in taxes than they would if the monarchy was abolished, thanks to the fact that the royal family generously hands over all their privately earned profit to the government in exchange for a fixed salary. Not only that, but historically, monarchs have taxed the people just enough so they could rule without problems, and the people weren't so much taxed to have the need to revolt. Modern monarchs usually have side businesses that pay people or organize charity events that they pay completely. Another example is the Habsburgs, who also got their money from the government. By the 19th century, care to guess how much of the state budget was allocated to maintain the Habsburg family? Only about 0.5 to 1%, which in that period was the same amount spent on the construction of new roads. Under monarchies, the monarch has to think in terms of his or her lifespan. If he taxes the nation into poverty in just a couple years, he'll become destitute. If he wants to pass the state to his children, he needs to have a long-time preference because they are like owners of property. Since the state is theirs, they don't want to damage it and are encouraged to tax the minimum needed to achieve his desired living standards/goals, and then leave the rest of the economy to maximize its growth, so they can work on long-time projects that will affect positively the nation and don't cause problems for when their children will rule. The opposite of a quote-unquote democratic society, where its leaders are not the owners of the state, but renters of it, thus no reason to make long-time improvements. No democratic leader owns their society, and so has no incentive to think beyond the next election. And this is why politicians are so negligent with spending, inflation, debt, and unlike a king and his heirs, democratic leaders don't have to deal with the consequences of their actions, so to maximize their impact, they begin to spend as much money as quickly as possible before their term expires, thus destroying the whole nation. So, no, monarchs do not hoard all the taxpayer money for themselves and spend it on whatever they want. Rather, monarchies come of economic benefit to the nation and the entire population. Monarchs have an actual reason to invest into their country because their children will inherit it in the end. Unlike democratic leaders who can come to power, spend as much money as possible, and leave so that the next one may deal with the issues. This is probably one of the most popular arguments against a monarchy. Why should someone by virtue of being born to the right parents have the right to exert power, whether absolute or not, over anyone else? I want to answer this with one simple question. Is there a completely fair way for someone to get into a high position of power, no matter the means? Why should someone who said the right kind of words to the right kind of people hold power over the entire nation, and not to mention the numerous ways these people get into positions of power in a republic? And I am not just talking about votes. Just because someone, for example, became president of a democratic nation through seemingly democratic means, doesn't mean that they got that position 100% fairly. Think about all the times these people used corruption to their advantage, how they can be greedy, and just how many times they lied to the very people that got them into power. But sure, it is more fair just because more people approve of them. A monarch, or specifically an heir, doesn't need to start a campaign, lie to his people, and use corruption because his position of power is already solidified from the very moment he or she exists in his mother's womb. In this case, all that needs to be done is to educate the young heir on how to run the nation as he gets older, and most of the time, monarchs who were educated from a young age on what to do and how to run the nation when they get into power have a higher possibility of being better rulers than a president who got into office from absolutely no previous experience or knowledge on what to do in that position. Also, it is important to say that having an heir makes politics and geopolitics much easier in that nation. You cannot rig whoever becomes the next monarch the same way one can rig an election, nor can you say for certain who will win the next election or elections afterwards, unlike in a monarchy where you can say with confidence exactly who will be in charge for the next couple of decades. Not to mention that inheritance is not just something practiced by a certain royal family, rather normal day people practice it as well. For example, a farmer will almost always let his son or sons inherit his farm with all the fruits and vegetables. Even businesses are known to be passed down from the father to the son or daughter. Even in this modern world, one can still find businesses that pass down the ownership to their relatives. If one can inherit property, wealth, furniture and titles, why is it so horrible to imagine that a person will inherit power as well? One cannot deny that in our modern world today, the idea of democracy is one of the most important systems a nation should have. The belief that the people should have a right to elect their leaders and steer the nation in the way they want it to go. And in most cases, monarchism is seen as the opposite, where the people are ruled by a king or queen who have the final say in terms of internal and foreign policy. But the truth of the matter is, monarchism is not mutually exclusive with democracy. People tend to mix up the term democracy with republic, that a democracy can only truly exist in a republican state. But history has shown otherwise. If we look at the nations of Europe after the Age of Enlightenment, we will see that the majority of monarchs at the turn of the 20th century were constitutional and had a democratic system already in place, whereas when we look at republics from that point forward, we will find that republics were vastly more authoritarian than your average European monarchy. The truth is, democracy and republicanism are definitely not the same thing. A republic is not always a democracy, as history has shown us with countries like the USSR, Yugoslavia, the Federal Republic of Austria, and the list goes on. By definition, democracy is, quote, a system of government in which the people of a country can elect their representatives, and that is exactly how democracy works in monarchies. While the people cannot vote for the head of state, i.e. the king, they can still very much vote for their representatives, like the prime minister, members of parliament, and also the leaders of their local administration, and then these representatives will work alongside the king to ensure the stability of the country. But of course, just like with republics, monarchies are not immune to autocracies, as we have seen with a few royal dictatorships and absolute monarchies. But the vast majority of monarchies, specifically in Europe at the turn of the 20th century, were constitutional, like for example the United Kingdom, which is still a monarchy to this day with a democratic system. But the United Kingdom was not the first constitutional monarchy we know of. We know for a fact that the first recorded constitutional monarchy in the world was the Hittite Empire from over 1500 BC, where, while the king was the supreme ruler of the land, many officials exercised independent authority over various branches of the government. Point being, democracy is not mutually exclusive with monarchism, specifically in a constitutional monarchy, where elections can still be held and where people may elect their representatives. And republics are not always democracies either. If anything, the majority of republics in the 20th century were more authoritarian than monarchies. One could still use the argument that constitutional monarchies are just crowned republics, but as long as there is a king on the throne, even if he is just ceremonial, then the country is still, by definition, a monarchy. For many people, the term monarchy evokes images of knights in shining armor and kings and queens from days long past. This image perpetuates the idea that a monarchy is an inherently outdated system that cannot possibly function in the modern post-industrial age. But this assumption is completely false and misleading. The institution of monarchy is not only compatible with the modern world and as effective as republican systems, but in my opinion, and the opinion of many others, it is even better than the alternatives. This notion stems from the fact that in most people's minds, the terms democracy and republic are synonymous, as I've stated. and that monarchies and democracies are incompatible. Nevertheless, 43 countries in the world still have some form of monarchy today, so it is not as unpopular as one might first think. Not only are almost a quarter of the world's countries still monarchies, but of the 10 countries with the highest quality of life, 5 are monarchies. So how is it that an outdated system is not only still practiced in many countries, but also produces one of the highest quality of life for its citizens? The answer is simple: it's not an outdated system. First of all, if you say that monarchy is an outdated system because it was created thousands of years ago, then surely you must agree that democracy is equally outdated because it was already practiced in ancient Greece. Just because a system has been practiced for a long time does not mean that it cannot adapt to the times. Secondly, monarchies have proven time and time again that they can work well alongside democracies, as I have explained previously. Most monarchs that still exist have adapted to the modern world. The days when monarchs ruled by the grace of God are long gone. Instead, they now rule based on a social contract in which both the monarch and the people live in a symbiotic relationship. The monarch also acts as a neutral voice in a democratic system, representing all citizens of a country, not just those who voted for the largest political party. This example can be seen in many countries such as Britain, Norway, Denmark, Sweden, the Benelux countries, etc. But even in the days of absolute monarchs and feudal lords, people like Charlemagne and Louis XIV could only dream of the powers that presidents and prime ministers have in some republics, which shows that monarchies can work better in some cases. From all this, we can see that the institution of monarchy is not obsolete and can function well in modern society. Corruption is one of the biggest issues a government can face, and considering how much people talk about corrupt politicians and rulers, it's no surprise that many like to say that monarchy is a corrupt system in of itself. But it's clear that people don't really understand what corrupt means. Just because someone has political power and is wealthy does not make them inherently corrupt. Nevertheless, if we look at history, we'll find that there were indeed a few corrupt kings or emperors, but as I said, only a few. The reason being is that monarchs don't really have a reason to be corrupt. The main reason why people engage in corruption in the first place is because of two things: money and power. But monarchs are already covered with both of these things from the moment they are born to the moment they let out their last breath. And this is the reason why so many monarchs weren't corrupt, simply because they didn't need to engage in corruption. Now some may point to a few monarchs like King Louis XVI and Nicholas II, whose countries were embroiled in revolution due to their quote-unquote corruption of hosting parties and presumably not caring about the lower classes. But that isn't corruption, it's just negligence, and most people confuse acts of negligence for acts of corruption. Republics, on the other hand, oh boy, is there a lot to unravel here. Now, I wouldn't really say that republics are inherently more corrupt, but rather they open up the possibility of corruption a lot more. So many politicians, prime ministers and presidents have been embroiled in corruption scandals and court cases that it's almost impossible to keep track of them all. That's why today when we hear that a politician is exposed for corruption, we don't act shocked, we just see it as another Tuesday. There are plenty of reasons why politicians are so likely to turn to corruption, and it always includes power and money. As I've previously stated, monarchs don't really have a reason to engage in corruption because they are already secured of both. Politicians, on the other hand, have every reason to engage in them. Their positions are always temporary, a couple years at most and they are out, so they try to make the best of their status as they can, get as much money and power as possible before their time is up. This is all made worse with a system of lobbying in a democratic republic. For those who are not aware, lobbying is the act of persuasion in politics for politicians to support a certain decision which they in the beginning did not support or were neutral. And I think you can definitely see how corrupt this system can get, since majority of the time, politicians get bribed by a certain group to support a bill that is in their favor. A famous example of this is when Walt Disney lobbied Congress to reform the copyright system just so they could retain personal ownership of their character Mickey Mouse. If anything, the modern world has proven that corruption is a lot more rampant in republics, but as I stated, it does not mean that republicanism is a corrupt system in of itself. In fact, I do not believe any system is inherently corrupt. But just like with republics, it doesn't mean monarchism is corruption-free, especially when we consider the parliaments. But to say that the monarch is corrupt in of itself is an entirely different story, and if anything, the monarch is the least corrupt figure in the country. Monarchy is obviously not a perfect system. In fact, no political system in this world is perfect. But the amount of slander monarchism gets from people who do not fully understand or comprehend it is just unfair. They see a rich man sitting on a golden throne with all the money in the world in the media and instantly conclude that this is all they really need to know about the whole system. As I have demonstrated, monarchism can be far more complicated than just a guy sitting in a castle with a lot of money. And people think that the position of a monarch is a privilege, but this assumption is far from right. Truth of the matter is, being a king is one of the most difficult positions a man can find himself in. A king stands alone against all who wish harm upon his people. He, without a sense of safety, has to have the will and duty to fight against all the evil in the world. Think about this and all the burdens this man has to carry, the expectations he needs to meet, and the duty that he has. Think of all this next time you envy the position of a monarch. As Sir Fulke Greville stated, quote, "The greatest slave in a kingdom is generally the king of it." End quote.